They say your life flashes before your eyes in the end. For me, it's not a flash. It's a slow, deliberate film that's been playing for 50 years. 50 years, my son called another woman mother. For 50 years, he called the man who created him, in an act of violence, brother. My story isn't about forgiveness. It's about a debt that has finally come due. The truth was buried, but graves can be unearthed. If you believe that no secret should stay hidden forever and that justice has no expiration date, then stay with me. Follow my story, like this video, and press that notification bell. The reckoning of the Hayes family is about to begin, and you won't want to miss a single moment. My name is Emma, and the face you see now, the one mapped with the fine, delicate lines of 70 years, holds a story that began in what I remember as the sun-drenched innocence of Havenwood, Ohio. It's a town that still exists in postcards and memories, a place of white picket fences and Sunday potlucks, where everyone knew your name and your business. To an outsider, it was perfect. To me, it was the meticulously crafted cage where I was raised. I remember Liam Hayes. Of course, I remember him. For the first 17 years of my life, he wasn't the monster he became. He was the other half of my soul. We were Emma and Liam, a single word spoken by everyone in town, a unit as fundamental as the church steeple and the old oak tree in the town square. We were inseparable. Our childhood was a blur of shared adventures, whispered secrets under starry summer skies, and scraped knees that we patched up together. I remember the splinter he pulled from my thumb with his mother's tweezers, his brow furrowed in concentration, his touch so gentle. I remember the time we built a raft out of old pallets and tried to sail it down Miller's Creek, sinking into the murky water, laughing so hard we could barely breathe. He was the sun, and I was the quiet, unassuming girl who orbited his brilliant light. He was the town's golden boy, the charismatic, handsome son of the wealthiest, most revered family in Havenwood. The Hayes family didn't just live in Havenwood, they owned it, in a way that was less about deeds and property lines and more about influence and legacy. Our friendship was the stuff of local legend. Mothers would watch us from their porches, a gentle smile on their faces, and murmur about how sweet it was, how pure. They saw a storybook friendship, a bond so unbreakable it was destined for a storybook ending. They admired it. I see that now. They weren't admiring a friendship. They were watching a lamb being patiently, lovingly groomed for slaughter. They were watching a long, slow, meticulous investment, and I was the asset, appreciating in value with every shared smile, every innocent moment of trust. The slaughter, when it came, was just the final transaction. The Hayes mansion on Sycamore Lane was a landmark. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. A monument of imposing white columns, sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns that seemed to repel weeds by sheer force of will, and windows that glittered like judgmental eyes looking down on the rest of the town. For most of my childhood and all of my adolescence, it was my second home. The front door, a heavy oak behemoth, was never locked to me. I would walk in without knocking, the scent of lemon polish and old respected money greeting me like a familiar hug. The air inside was always cool, still, as if the house itself existed outside the normal flow of time. Mrs. Hayes, Eleanor, was a vision of serene elegance. She glided through the cavernous rooms in cashmere sweaters and tailored slacks, her silver hair always perfectly coiffed. Her smile was constant, a gentle, placid curve of her lips that radiated a warmth I mistook for love. She would call me her second daughter. "Oh, Emma, dear," she'd say, her voice a soft melody. "Liam is so lucky to have you. I don't know what he'd do without his Emma." She'd place a delicate, cool hand on my cheek, and I would bask in her approval, feeling chosen, special. Mr. Hayes, Arthur, was a different kind of presence. He was a formidable man, a senior partner at the most powerful law firm in the state, with a voice that could command a courtroom and a gaze that seemed to see right through you. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, they carried the weight of stone tablets. He would find me reading in their vast library or waiting for Liam in the sunroom, and he'd stop, a rare, small smile playing on his lips. He'd ruffle my hair, a gesture that felt both paternal and proprietary. "Still here, Emma?" he'd ask, the question a statement. "Good girl. Loyalty. It's the most important thing." He praised my loyalty to Liam, my devotion. He made me feel that my entire purpose was to be this steady, unwavering presence in his son's life. They fostered our closeness with an architect's precision. They encouraged my constant presence, insisted on it. If I spent a Saturday at my own modest home, Mrs. Hayes would call my mother. "Is everything all right, Jean? Liam is just beside himself without Emma. The house feels so empty." My own parents, simple, hard-working people, were flattered by the attention. They saw the Hayes' affection for me as a blessing, a golden opportunity. "They think the world of you, honey," my mother would say, her eyes shining with pride. "You're like one of the family." I was made to feel cherished, protected, an integral part of their perfect world. I see it now with the clarity that only decades of silent screaming can provide. Their home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a carefully constructed stage. The grand staircase was a set piece, the manicured garden a backdrop. Every comfortable chair, every priceless vase, every leather-bound book was a prop. And I was the lead actress, the star of the show, who hadn't been given the script. I was playing a part I didn't know I'd been cast in, reciting lines I thought were my own, moving toward a final act that had been written long before I ever stepped through their door. They weren't protecting me. They were isolating me, curating me, ensuring I was perfectly primed for my one true purpose in their dynastic ambitions. Perfection, especially the kind that is meticulously manufactured, always has a flaw, a weak seam, a tiny, almost invisible crack that, under the right pressure, will splinter and shatter the whole illusion. The first crack in Liam's flawless golden facade appeared during the sweltering heat of the annual county fair. The air was thick with the smell of fried dough, sawdust, and livestock. The cacophony of the midway, the barkers' calls, the screams from the rickety rides, the cheerful organ music, was the soundtrack of summer in Havenwood. It was a place of pure, unadulterated joy. I was 16. I had wandered away from Liam for a few minutes to look at the agricultural exhibits. I found myself talking to a boy named Thomas Miller, whose family owned a farm a few miles out of town. He was shy, with kind eyes and hands that were stained with honest dirt. We were having a harmless, pleasant chat about his prize-winning pumpkin, a monstrous, lopsided gourd he was ridiculously proud of. I remember laughing, a genuine, easy laugh, at a joke he made about feeding it beer to help it grow. It was a moment of simple, uncomplicated connection, lasting no more than 5 minutes. When I turned back to find Liam, he was standing a few feet away, leaning against the fence of the pig pen, an unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. The easy, charming smile he usually wore was gone. It had been wiped clean away, and in its place was a look of such cold, possessive fury that it felt like a physical blow. It stole the air from my lungs and made the cheerful sounds of the fair recede into a dull, distant roar. His eyes, usually a warm, sparkling blue, were flat and hard as chips of ice. It wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something ancient and territorial. It was the look of a king surveying a subject who had dared to step out of line. It was ownership. It was there for only a second, maybe 2. A fleeting glimpse behind the curtain. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, his entire demeanor shifted. The charming mask slipped back into place so smoothly, it was dizzying. The ice in his eyes melted back into a familiar warmth. He pushed himself off the fence and strolled toward me, a lazy grin spreading across his face. "There you are," he said, his voice casual, easy. He looped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me against his side in a gesture that felt less like an embrace and more like a reassertion of control. He nodded curtly at Thomas, a dismissive gesture that rendered the other boy invisible. My heart was still hammering against my ribs. "Liam, is everything okay?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. He squeezed my shoulder. "Perfect. Just the damn heat, you know. It's getting to me." He glanced up at the blazing afternoon sun and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. A perfect piece of acting. "Come on. I'll win you that giant teddy bear you were eyeing." And I believed him. Or rather, I chose to. It was so much easier to accept his simple, logical explanation than to confront the terrifying thing I had seen in his eyes. It's easy to ignore a single hairline crack when you are desperately, wholly convinced that the entire structure is sound. The alternative, that the person you trust most in the world has a core of cold darkness, was too monstrous to contemplate. so I let him lead me away. I let the warmth of his arm and the familiar charm of his smile soothe my unease. I dismissed the incident as a flicker, a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. I helped him nail the lie into place, becoming a willing accomplice in my own deception. It was a warning, the first toll of a bell I refused to hear. The night the music died, the night my life was cleaved in two, was the night of Liam's 18th birthday party. The Hayes mansion, usually so stately and controlled, throbbed with a different kind of energy. It was alive with music that vibrated through the floorboards, with the boisterous laughter of 100 guests, and with the clinking of champagne glasses. It was a coming-of-age party for Havenwood's prince, and the entire town, or at least its most important members, had turned out to pay homage. I felt strangely adrift in the sea of smiling, unfamiliar faces. I wore a pale blue dress that Mrs. Hayes had picked out for me, another gesture of her supposed affection, but I felt like I was wearing a costume. He found me in the library. I had slipped away from the noise and the crush of people, seeking the familiar quiet of the room that had always felt like a haven within the house. The library was the heart of Arthur Hayes's power, shelves stretching to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound books on law, finance, and history, the tools of his dynasty. The air smelled of old paper and polish. The only sound was the muffled bass of the party bleeding through the thick, closed doors. Liam entered the room and shut the door behind him, plunging us into a sudden, profound silence. He wasn't drunk or wild-eyed. He was unnervingly calm, his movements deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He didn't use force, not at first. He used something far more powerful, far more insidious. He used our history. He used the 16 years of trust I had placed in him, every shared secret, every childhood promise. He walked toward me, his steps slow and measured on the thick Persian rug. "I knew I'd find you here," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Our place." He stood in front of me, so close I could see the flicker of the desk lamp reflected in his eyes. He took my hands in his. His were warm. "Emma," he began, and the way he said my name was a soft incantation. "Look at us, all these years. Everyone out there," he gestured vaguely toward the door. "They're just noise. It's always been just you and me. You know that, right?" I nodded, my throat tight. "This is a big night," he continued, his thumbs stroking the backs of my hands. "I'm a man now. And things have to solidify. Everything we've been, everything we are, has been leading to this moment. It's destiny, Emma. Don't you feel it? It's like a string that's been pulling us together since we were kids." He was twisting years of pure, innocent friendship into a cage, and I was too mesmerized by his words to see the bars closing around me. He spoke of destiny, of how we were meant to be one, how our bond was something transcendent, something the rest of the world couldn't possibly understand. He made it sound sacred, inevitable, like a coronation. He was anointing me. The act itself was quiet, methodical, and utterly soul-destroying. He led me to the large leather sofa, his touch gentle, his words a constant, hypnotic murmur in my ear. He dismantled me piece by piece, not with aggression, but with a chilling sense of entitlement. It wasn't a burst of uncontrollable passion. It was a claiming. It was the calm, deliberate execution of a long-held plan. While it was happening, I stared over his shoulder at the rows upon rows of books, their gold-leaf titles gleaming dully in the dim light. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the legacy they're all so proud of. It's built on this. This silence, this cold, methodical theft. My body was there, on the sofa, but my mind had retreated to a distant, cold place. I felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. When it was over, there was no apology, no sign of remorse. He simply moved away from me, stood up, and straightened the collar of his expensive, tailored shirt. He smoothed his hair back into place. The casualness of the gesture was the most violent part of the entire ordeal. He looked down at me, still lying on the sofa, the pale blue dress twisted around my waist. There was no emotion on his face, only a cool, detached satisfaction. It was the look of a businessman who had just closed a successful, if unpleasant, deal. He adjusted his cuffs, See, he said, his voice perfectly even. We were always heading here. This was always going to happen. Then he turned, walked to the heavy oak door, and left. He stepped back into the party, back into the music and the laughter, leaving me alone on the floor of the silent library, surrounded by the leather-bound books that represented his family's untouchable legacy. The muffled sounds of celebration from the other side of the door felt like a mockery, a surreal soundtrack to the complete and utter demolition of my world. I was 17 years old, and my life was over. I just didn't know it yet. I thought it was the end of a chapter. I didn't realize it was the beginning of a war. The world didn't just spin. It stopped. For weeks, a sick, heavy stillness had settled in my bones, a lethargy that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a creeping, biological dread. The moon waxed and waned, and a certain rhythm my body had known since I was 13 failed to arrive. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the trauma of that night in the library, a physical echo of a psychological wound. But deep down, in the silent, honest corners of my mind, I knew. I bought the test from a drugstore in the next town over, paying in cash and hiding the small, rectangular box in the bottom of my purse like it was contraband. Back in the cold, impersonal silence of my family's bathroom, with its cracked linoleum and dripping faucet, I performed the ritual. The instructions were clinical, detached. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the plastic stick steady. Then came the waiting. 3 minutes that stretched into an eternity. I didn't sit. I paced the tiny space, my bare feet cold on the floor, my own reflection in the fogged mirror a stranger's, pale, haunted, eyes too wide. I couldn't look at it directly at first. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, lying on the edge of the sink, a stark white sentinel guarding the gates of my future. I forced myself to turn, to breathe, to look. 2 lines. 2 impossibly dark, clear blue lines. They didn't whisper a possibility. They screamed a verdict. Pregnant. The word was an avalanche, burying me, suffocating me. The air rushed out of my lungs, replaced by a sound that was half sob, half gasp. I slid down the wall, the cold porcelain of the bathtub pressing against my back, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle the scream. This was not a baby. This was a parasite. A living, growing monument to my violation, conceived in violence and nurtured by my silence. And yet, through the thick fog of horror, a single, treacherous sliver of light appeared, a desperate, idiotic hope that only a 17-year-old girl, still clinging to the ghost of a friendship, could entertain. Liam. Maybe this thing, this child, would be the jolt that would awaken him. Maybe the undeniable reality of a life we had created, however horrifically, would shatter the cold, calculating shell he had shown me that night. Maybe it would bring back the boy who shared his secrets with me under the willow tree, the boy whose laughter was once the soundtrack to my summers. I had to tell him. It felt like the only move left on a chessboard where I had already been checkmated. Finding him was easy. He was exactly where I knew he would be on a Saturday afternoon, skipping stones across the creek at the edge of his family's property. It was our place. A place so steeped in the innocence of our shared history that standing there now felt like a sacrilege. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just turned, a flat, unreadable expression on his face, a smooth river stone still in his hand. "Emma," he said. His voice wasn't warm, nor was it cold. It was neutral, like a doctor addressing a patient. The words caught in my throat. I just stood there, the little box from the drugstore clutched in my hand inside my coat pocket, its sharp corners digging into my palm. "What is it?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't impatient. He was simply waiting for the next piece of information. I started, my voice a pathetic whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again, forcing the words out. "I'm pregnant, Liam." I watched his face for a flicker of anything. Shock, fear, regret, joy even, in some twisted corner of my hopeful mind. There was nothing. His expression didn't change, but I saw a subtle shift behind his eyes. It was as if he was running a calculation, processing a new variable in a complex equation. The boy I knew was gone. This was someone else entirely. This was a Hayes. He tossed the stone in his hand. It skipped 3 times before sinking into the murky water. "Okay," he said, the word falling into the quiet air like a chip of ice. "Okay?" My voice cracked. "That's all you have to say? Liam, this is our baby." He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and his eyes were the color of winter. "I know," he said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "We'll handle it." Handle it? What does that even mean? This isn't a broken toy, Liam. This is a person. He took a step towards me, and I flinched. He stopped. "I know what it is, Emma. Crying about it by the creek isn't going to solve anything. This is a complication, one that needs to be managed properly." There it was. Not a tragedy, not a miracle, a complication, an item on an agenda. The last wisp of my foolish hope died right there on the muddy bank of that creek. He had not been overtaken by some momentary madness in the library. This was him. The cold, controlled creature standing before me was the real Liam Hayes, and the boy I had loved had been a carefully constructed fiction. "What are we going to do?" I asked, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He didn't hesitate. "We're going to tell my parents," he said. "They'll know how to proceed." He reached out and took my hand. It was the same gesture he'd used 1,000 times before to pull me up a hill or lead me through a crowd. But now it felt different. It wasn't the warm, familiar grip of my best friend. It was a cold, firm manacle, and he was leading me not toward safety, but to judgment. The drive to his house was silent. The familiar streets of Havenwood, the manicured lawns and stately homes, blurred into a meaningless watercolor outside the window. I felt disembodied, like I was watching a movie about some other poor girl's life. The Hayes mansion on Sycamore Street loomed at the end of the road, not as a welcoming second home, but as a courthouse. Liam led me through the side door, into the hushed, cavernous interior that smelled of lemon polish and old money. He didn't take me to the living room or the kitchen. He led me straight to the one room I now feared more than any other, the library. But this time, the heavy doors were already open, and they were waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes sat in the 2 high-backed leather armchairs opposite the great, unlit fireplace. It was a tableau, a carefully staged scene of quiet authority. Mr. Hayes, immaculate in a cashmere sweater, his silver hair perfectly combed, sat with his hands steepled, his lawyerly gaze fixed on me. Mrs. Hayes, elegant and poised in a silk blouse, had a face etched with a kind of practiced, serene concern. There were no shouts, no accusations, no drama. That wasn't their way. Their power was in their absolute, unnerving calm. I started to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shivering that began in my legs and worked its way up my spine. Liam released my hand and moved to stand behind his father's chair, a silent soldier falling into rank. It was Mrs. Hayes who spoke first, her voice a soft, melodic murmur. "Emma, dear, come, sit down. You look frozen." She rose and glided towards me. Before I could protest, she had taken a thick cashmere blanket from the back of the sofa and wrapped it around my shoulders. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it felt like being swaddled for slaughter. The wool was heavy, suffocating. "There now," she cooed, guiding me into the chair directly opposite her husband. "Liam told us. We're going to take care of everything. You don't need to worry about a thing." I couldn't speak. I just clutched the edges of the blanket, my knuckles white, and stared into the abyss of Mr. Hayes's face. He was the conductor of this orchestra, and he was just waiting for the overture of his wife's manufactured kindness to end. "Emma," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, the voice he used in courtrooms to dismantle witnesses with surgical precision. "First, let us be clear. We are all on the same side here. We want what is best for everyone involved." He let the words hang in the air, weighted with a false sincerity that made my stomach churn. "This is, without question, an unfortunate situation," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "A difficult circumstance brought about by youthful intensity. But it is a situation that can be managed with discretion and careful planning." Situation. Circumstance. The words were so sterile, so clinical. He was a master of language, and he was using it to build a wall around the ugly truth, brick by euphemistic brick. He spoke of my trauma as if it were a minor scheduling conflict, a regrettable but ultimately fixable line item on a budget. The assault, the violation, the terror, none of it existed in this room. In the world of the Hayes, there was no rape. There was only an inconvenience that threatened the smooth upward trajectory of their family's narrative. Mrs. Hayes poured tea from a silver service that had appeared silently on a side table. The clink of porcelain was the only sound for a long moment. She handed me a cup, her manicured fingers brushing mine. Her touch was cold. "Drink this, dear," she said. "It will calm your nerves. We know this is a shock for you, but you are not alone. We are a family, and we will face this problem together." Problem. Another word to add to the lexicon of denial. I looked from her placid face to her husband's mask of paternal concern, and finally to Liam, who stood silently in the background, his expression a perfect mirror of his father's. They were a united front, a seamless entity of power and control. My own voice, my own truth, felt impossibly small and weak in the face of their quiet, crushing consensus. They weren't just ignoring my pain, they were methodically, deliberately erasing it. They were repackaging my life's greatest horror into a neat, manageable little box, and I was being told to be grateful for the service. Mr. Hayes leaned forward slightly, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of intimate, conspiratorial reason. "Emma, my wife and I have been discussing the best path forward. We have considered all the angles, all the potential outcomes, and we believe we have formulated a solution that protects everyone. It protects Liam's future, it protects the family's name, and most importantly, it protects you." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt like a client in his office, not the victim of his son's crime. He was about to present his terms. "It is a comprehensive plan," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth, but of satisfaction. The smile of a man who has found the perfect, elegant solution to a messy variable. "Here is what we propose," he began, laying it out like a business proposal. "There is a facility, a private retreat, in a quiet part of Vermont. It's more of a wellness sanctuary, really. Very discreet, very comfortable. We will arrange for you to stay there for the duration of your condition." He paused, letting the clinical term hang in the air. He made my pregnancy sound like a curable disease. "You will have the best medical care, complete privacy. No one here in Havenwood will need to know anything. We'll simply let it be known that you've gone to stay with a sick aunt for a while. It's a clean narrative." My mind was reeling. A retreat, a sick aunt. He was mapping out a fiction to conceal my reality. Mrs. Hayes nodded in serene agreement. "It's a beautiful place, Emma. The mountain air is so restorative. It will be a time for you to rest and reflect, away from all this stress." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that the only stress was sitting in this very room. But I was frozen, trapped in the web of their calm, logical insanity. Mr. Hayes continued, his voice dropping even lower. "When the time comes, you will have the baby. In secret, of course. All arrangements will be made. The finest doctors, a private suite. It will all be handled." He let that sink in before delivering the final, devastating blow. "And then," he said, his eyes glinting with a strange proprietary light, "we will adopt him." The words hit me with the force of a physical impact. Adopt him. My son. Their grandson. "He will come home with us," Mr. Hayes explained, his voice swelling with a kind of magnanimous pride. He will be raised here, in this house. He will have the Hayes name. He will have every advantage, the best schools, a legacy to inherit, a perfect life. He leaned back in his chair, a look of profound satisfaction on his face, as if he had just presented me with the most generous gift imaginable. And you, Emma, he concluded, waving a dismissive hand, can go on with your life. You can go to college, build a career, get married. You will be free, unburdened by a youthful mistake. I finally found my voice. It was a choked, strangled whisper. Unburdened? The room swam before my eyes. They weren't just covering up a crime. They were harvesting its fruit. My son, my child, the product of my violation, was not a human being to them. He wasn't a consequence of their son's brutality. He was a prize. He was a commodity. He was the next male heir in the Hayes dynasty, procured through a sordid but efficient transaction. They were not offering me a solution. They were telling me the price of my silence, and the price was my child. They saw him as a blank slate on which they could write their name, a continuation of their precious bloodline, and I was merely the unwilling, inconvenient vessel for his delivery. The horror of it was so vast, so complete, that it was almost sublime. This wasn't a family meeting. It was an acquisition. For a moment, I said nothing. I just sat there, the heavy blanket a shroud, the lukewarm tea untouched beside me. I looked at their faces. Mr. Hayes, the architect of my ruin, looking at me with patient expectation, Mrs. Hayes, the serene accomplice, her smile a placid mask. And Liam, my Liam, his face a blank canvas, his soul seemingly hollowed out and replaced with the cold ambition of his family. They were a trinity of power, and they had just laid out the terms of my surrender. But something inside me, a small, flickering ember of defiance that I thought had been extinguished, flared to life. It was a weak flame, but it was enough. I slowly unwrapped the blanket from my shoulders and let it fall to the floor. I met Mr. Hayes's gaze directly, my own eyes burning with a sudden hot clarity. No, I whispered. The word was quiet, but it landed in the oppressive silence of the room like a thrown stone. Mr. Hayes's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. I beg your pardon? No, I said again, my voice gaining strength. You can't have my baby. You can't send me away and steal my child. I took a shaky breath, and finally, I gave the thing a name. I spoke the word they had so carefully avoided, the word that would shatter their sterile narrative. What Liam did to me, it was abuse. He hurt me. The shift was instantaneous. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the room into an Arctic cold. The mask of paternal concern on Mr. Hayes's face didn't just slip, it evaporated. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by 2 chips of granite. Mrs. Hayes's serene smile tightened into a thin, bloodless line. Even Liam, standing in the shadows, seemed to straighten, his posture becoming more rigid, more defensive. Mr. Hayes leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany of his desk. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer smooth or reasonable. It was sharp. It was steel. Be very, very careful what you say in this house, young lady, he said, each word a clipped, precise threat. You are on incredibly thin ice. It's the truth, I insisted, my own voice trembling but resolute. He used me. He assaulted me. Mr. Hayes let out a short, contemptuous laugh. It was a terrifying sound. The truth? He scoffed. Let me tell you what the truth will be if you ever repeat that word outside of this room. If you breathe a whisper of this slanderous fantasy to anyone, I will not hesitate to use the full force of my resources to protect my family. And my resources, Emma, are limitless. He stood up, towering over me from behind his desk, a judge pronouncing sentence. First, he began, ticking off the points on his fingers. I will file a lawsuit against you for defamation of character that will financially cripple your family for generations. I will prove in a court of law that you are a liar, a malicious, unstable girl. My blood ran cold. Second, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl, I will construct a narrative about you in this town that you will never escape. I will tell everyone that you were the one who was obsessed. That you stalked my son for years, desperate for his attention. I will find a dozen witnesses, friends of Liam, people who saw you always hanging around, who will testify that you were emotionally volatile, that you threw yourself at him, that you couldn't handle his rejection. He paused, letting the poison sink in. He wasn't just threatening legal action. He was threatening to rewrite my entire identity. And then, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with chilling cruelty, I will bring up your family's financial situation. It won't be difficult to paint a picture of a desperate girl from a struggling family, trying to trap the son of the wealthiest family in town. A gold digger, Emma. That's what they'll call you. Do you think anyone will believe the poor troubled girl over the golden son of Havenwood? He leaned further across the desk, his voice a final, fatal whisper. No one will believe you, Emma. No one. Because in this town, we are the Hayes. We built the hospital your mother was born in. We funded the library where you used to read. Our name is on plaques, on buildings, on charity donations. Our name means something here. It means integrity. It means power. He stood back up to his full height, looking down at me with an expression of absolute final authority. He delivered the last line not as a question, but as a statement of fact, an epitaph for my aborted rebellion. We are the Hayes, he repeated, his voice soft but absolute. And who are you? I had no answer. In that moment, I was nobody. I was a ghost in their machine, a footnote in their grand story. He had laid out my ruin with the surgical precision of a master strategist, showing me the abyss that waited for me if I dared to speak my truth. They weren't leaving me with a choice. There was no choice. There was only their way, or public annihilation. There was silence and exile, or a social death so complete I would never recover. The fight went out of me, leaving behind a vast, silent, desolate landscape of terror. I looked at the three of them, a tribunal that had already passed its sentence. They had won before the battle had even begun. I was trapped, not by the walls of the library, but by the invisible, inescapable fortress of their name, their money, and their power. And in the chilling silence of that room, I surrendered. I gave them my silence. I gave them my future. I gave them my son. For 50 years, I did not live. I existed. I became a study in the art of being invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of my own story. Silence was the price of survival, a heavy cloak I pulled around myself each morning and shed only in the privacy of my nightmares. I moved 3 towns over, a distance that felt both impossibly far and dangerously close. I found a small apartment above a flower shop, the scent of lilies and carnations a constant cloying funeral wreath for the life I'd lost. I worked as a librarian's assistant, a fitting profession for a woman whose own story was locked away, unread, on a forgotten shelf. I learned to find comfort in the quiet rustle of turning pages, in the tidy, predictable order of the Dewey Decimal System. It was a life built of small, quiet things, a fortress of routine designed to keep the past at bay. But the past is not a dog you can command to stay. It is a tide, forever pulling at the shore of the present. And my son, Daniel, he was the constant, silent ache in my soul. I watched him from a distance, a spectator at the grand theater of his life. I would buy the Havenwood Chronicle just to scan the society pages, my heart lurching whenever I saw his name. Daniel Hayes, winning the regional science fair. Daniel Hayes, captain of the high school football team, his smile bright and uncomplicated under the stadium lights. Daniel Hayes, graduating from college, his arm around a smiling girl, with Liam and his parents beaming beside him. They called me a surrogate, a woman hired to perform a service, who took her payment and disappeared without a backward glance. It was a clean, simple story, and Havenwood, a town that prized clean, simple stories, accepted it without question. They raised him as Liam's younger brother, a late-in-life surprise for the esteemed Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, and Daniel, my Daniel, believed it. How could he not? He was loved. He was privileged. He was a Hayes. The truth was a monster, and they had kept it locked securely in the cellar of his heart. My rage over the decades did not die. It transformed. It was no longer a bonfire, hot and wild and consuming. It became a pilot light, a tiny, blue, unwavering flame deep inside me. It was a patient, cold thing, waiting for the right conditions, for a gust of wind to turn it into an inferno. For 50 years it waited. And then, on a Tuesday morning, the wind came. It arrived in the form of a glossy magazine supplement tucked inside the morning paper. "Titans of Philanthropy," the headline blared. And there they were, the Hayes family, gathered on the manicured lawn of the house on Sycamore Street. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, older now, their faces a mask of benevolent dignity. Liam, his hair graying at the temples, his arm around his own smiling, society-approved wife. And Daniel, my son, standing slightly apart, handsome and strong, the perfect image of a successful young man, his expression one of quiet gratitude toward the family that had given him everything. The article was a symphony of praise. It lauded their contributions to the new hospital wing, their funding of university scholarships, their tireless work in preserving Havenwood's historic downtown. It painted them as the bedrock of the community, the gold standard of civic virtue. A quote from Mr. Hayes stood out. "Family is everything," he'd said, his eyes crinkling for the camera. "It is the legacy we build, the foundation upon which all good things stand. We have always believed in strengthening those foundations, in ensuring the Hayes name is synonymous with integrity and strength for generations to come." Integrity. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. I sat at my small kitchen table, the cheap ceramic mug of tea growing cold in my hands, and I felt the pilot light inside me roar to life. The 50 years of silence, of self-imposed exile, of swallowing my own screams, it all coalesced into a single, clarifying point of white-hot certainty. The statute of limitations had long since run out on the crime committed against me. The legal system, with its demand for fresh evidence and timely complaints, was a door that had rusted shut decades ago. A lawsuit would be my word against theirs, and I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a lifelong victim, whose word Havenwood would believe, but my revenge was never going to be about a courtroom. A courtroom offered settlement, a verdict. I wanted something more elemental. I wanted deconstruction. I wanted to take their legacy, this shining edifice of lies they had so carefully constructed, and I wanted to pull it down, brick by glittering, rotten brick. My plan would not be a lawsuit. It would be an unearthing. I would become an archaeologist of my own pain, and I would dig. Not just into Liam, the spoiled, vicious boy who had been the instrument of my ruin. I would dig into the very bedrock of the Hayes dynasty itself. I would find the rot in their foundation, and I would expose it to the sun. The article lay on my table, a glossy declaration of war. I folded it neatly, tucked it into my purse, and for the first time in 50 years, I felt the tremors of an earthquake that I, myself, was about to create. My quest began in the one place I knew better than my own small apartment, the library. But not the cheerful, sunlit main floor where I worked. My journey took me down to the archives in the basement, a place few people ever visited. It was a crypt of forgotten history, smelling of dust, decaying paper, and the faint, metallic scent of time itself. The head librarian, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose life was a catalog of other people's stories, gave me the key without a second thought. "Working on a little local history project, Emma?" he'd asked, his voice reedy. I just nodded, the lie feeling small and insignificant compared to the one I was about to uncover. For weeks, that basement became my world. I lost myself in the crackling pages of old newspapers, their headlines announcing wars and elections that were now just footnotes in history books. I hunched over the microfilm reader, the whirring of the machine a hypnotic soundtrack to my search, the glowing green text scrolling past my tired eyes. I started not with my own story, but with the generations before. I was looking for something, though I didn't yet know what. A crack, a discrepancy, a loose thread in the perfectly woven tapestry of the Hayes family narrative. I started with Liam's father, a man presented to the world as a paragon of fiscal and moral rectitude. I traced his life backward through the society pages. His marriage to Liam's mother was a major event, a union of Havenwood's old money and a family with political connections from the city, a strategic alliance. But as I scrolled through the months leading up to their engagement announcement, I found something else. It was small, almost unnoticeable. A brief mention in a column about local happenings. A young woman, a seamstress named Clara Bellwether, had given birth to a boy. No father was named. A tragedy for a girl of her station in those days. 6 months later, a formal announcement appeared in the same paper. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes Sr., Liam's grandparents, had formally adopted a baby boy, their son's son. They claimed their own son, Liam's father, was too young and focused on his burgeoning career to raise a child, and the mother was unwell. The story was that they were stepping in, nobly, to raise their own grandchild. The boy was given the Hayes name. He grew up to be the man who would one day threaten to destroy me. My breath caught in my throat. It was a coincidence, surely. A sad but not uncommon story from a bygone era. I filed it away and kept digging. I went back another generation, to Liam's grandfather. A man lauded in his time for his shrewd business acumen, expanding the family fortune through timber and textiles. His marriage was also a strategic one, to the daughter of a banking magnate. I spent a week poring over the records from his youth, and there it was again, the same chilling echo. A year before his pristine, high-society wedding, a girl who worked in one of his family's mills, Eleanor Vance, gave birth to a son. The birth was recorded in the county ledger, the father's name a blank space. The whispers in the archives, the margin notes scribbled by long-dead librarians, the gossip columns written in coded language spoke of her quiet disgrace. She left town not long after. A few months later, an announcement from the Hayes family. They had taken in a young orphan, a distant relative, they claimed. They would raise him as their own. That boy, Liam's grandfather, inherited the family business. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, began to pool in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a blueprint. I worked feverishly, my fingers stained with ink and dust, my eyes burning from the screen's green glow. I went back further, to the founder of the dynasty, Thaddeus Hayes, who had arrived in Havenwood in the late 19th century. He was the architect of their empire, and he was the architect of this too. Before his own advantageous marriage, a child was born to a local farmer's daughter, a girl who was loyal, hard-working, and utterly powerless. The child, a boy, was taken into the Hayes household, raised not as a son, but as a ward, and eventually became the second in command of his unacknowledged father's business. The pattern was undeniable, a dark and twisted helix woven into the family's DNA. It was a generational ritual, a grotesque tradition passed down from father to son. They didn't leave their heirs to chance, to the vagaries of a strategic marriage with a powerful and potentially troublesome wife. No, they secured their primary bloodline first. They selected a young woman from the town, someone unremarkable, someone whose family was dependent on their goodwill, someone who could be easily managed or dismissed. They created an heir, a pure-blooded Hayes boy, and then they took him, absorbing him into the family while erasing the mother from the story completely. The child was a blank slate they could mold from birth, free from the influence of a high-society mother and her powerful family. It wasn't about love or lust. It wasn't even about mistakes. It was a cold, calculated program of eugenics. It was a system for manufacturing heirs, ensuring the continuation of their power, uncontested and absolute. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair, the dusty air of the archive feeling thick and suffocating. The room spun. All these years, I had seen my tragedy as singular, a private horror that had shattered my life alone. I had been wrong. I wasn't the first. I wasn't a unique victim of Liam's monstrousness. I was simply the next chapter in their long, sordid history. Clara Bellwether, Eleanor Vance, the unnamed farmer's daughter. We were a secret sorority of ghosts, a long line of sacrificial lambs chosen for our silence, our loyalty, our social inferiority. We were the breeding stock, and our sons were the harvest. And my son, Daniel, was the latest prize. The realization didn't lessen my pain. It magnified it, stretching it back through a century of calculated cruelty. The foundation of the Hayes family wasn't built on integrity and strength. It was built on our bodies, on our silence, and on the sons they stole from us. The archives had given me the what. They had shown me the horrifying pattern, the skeleton of the conspiracy. But a skeleton is not a confession. I had dates, names, a well-founded theory, but it was still circumstantial. It was a story I had pieced together from shadows and echoes. To truly bring down a dynasty, I needed the how. I needed the proof, the undeniable internal documentation of their crimes. I needed to find the heart of the machine. The trail in the public record had gone cold. For weeks, I felt like I was back where I started, with a monstrous truth that no one would believe. I needed a new thread, a different kind of witness, not one of paper, but of flesh and blood, someone who had been inside the walls. My mind sifted through the names of all who had worked for the Hayes family over the years: chefs, housekeepers, drivers. Most were either long gone or still bound by a fierce, fearful loyalty. But then I remembered him, Mr. Abernathy, not the librarian, but his older brother, Thomas Abernathy. He had been the head groundskeeper at the Hayes estate for over 40 years, a quiet, stooped man who had treated the gardens with a reverence he never showed the people who owned them. I recalled hearing he'd been let go abruptly a few years back, replaced by a corporate landscaping company. The talk at the time was that he'd grown too old, too slow. I found him in the Havenwood Meadows nursing home, a sterile beige facility that smelled of antiseptic and regret. He was sitting in a faded armchair by a window, staring out at a parking lot. He looked smaller than I remembered, withered by age and resentment. His hands, which had once been thick with calloused strength from decades of working the earth, were now pale and trembled slightly. "Mr. Abernathy?" I said softly. He turned his head slowly, his eyes cloudy with cataracts, but sharpening with recognition. Emma Sullivan. I haven't seen you since you were a girl." We spoke for a while about nothing in particular, the weather, the failings of the nursing home's cafeteria. I could feel his bitterness, a low, simmering anger at having been discarded by the family he had served for a lifetime. He called them the Royals on the Hill. "They get rid of anything that's no longer useful," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Old trees, old tools, old people." I decided to take the risk. I leaned in closer, my voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Abernathy, I need your help. I'm looking into the Hayes family, their history." His eyes narrowed. "There's the history they print in the papers, and there's the history they bury. Which one are you looking for?" "The one they bury," I said. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, as if watching a movie only he could see. "The library," he finally said. "Old Man Hayes, Liam's grandfather. He was a meticulous man, believed in records, believed in secrets. He always used to say, 'The safest place is in plain sight.'" "What about the library?" I pressed, my heart beginning to beat faster. "The portrait," he continued, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. "The big one over the fireplace. The founder, Thaddeus Hayes himself. The old man was proud of that painting, but he was prouder of what was behind it, used to check it every Sunday night, said he was balancing the family books." A hidden safe. Behind the portrait of the patriarch. It was almost too perfect, too cinematic, but as he described the specific way the frame was hinged, the small, almost invisible release latch hidden in the ornate carvings, I knew it was real. He was giving me the key. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meticulous planning. I felt a strange and terrible clarity, the kind that comes when all other options have been stripped away. I studied the new landscaping company's schedule. I learned the patterns of the private security patrols. I used my savings to buy a simple lock-picking kit online, practicing for hours on the locks of my own apartment until my fingers were sore. The irony was not lost on me. The librarian, the woman who had spent her life in the quiet order of books, was now planning a burglary. The night I chose was moonless and cold. A damp chill clung to the air, weaving its way through my thin jacket. Standing at the edge of the woods, Looking at the house on Sycamore Street, I felt a wave of nausea. It stood there, silhouetted against the dark sky, a sleeping monster. It was no longer the magical place of my childhood. It was a mausoleum, a tomb full of ghosts, and I was about to willingly step inside. For a moment, my courage failed me. The 50 years of fear screamed at me to turn back, to return to my small, safe life. But then I saw Daniel's face in my mind, his unknowing smile in that magazine photo, and the cold rage returned, pushing the fear aside. Getting in was easier than I'd expected. A ground floor window in the pantry, just as the groundskeeper had told me, had a faulty latch. The click as it gave way was deafening in the silence. I slipped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air was still and cold, thick with the scent of lemon polish, old paper, and money. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet was a gunshot in the dark. I moved through the house like a phantom, my memory guiding me through the familiar layout. Past the grand staircase where I had once slid down the banister, past the living room where I had played games with Liam. Each room was a crime scene of memory. Finally, I reached the library. It was exactly as I remembered, a shrine of dark wood and leather. The fireplace was cold and empty, and above it, the portrait of Thaddeus Hayes stared down at me, his painted eyes seeming to follow my every move. I ran my trembling fingers along the bottom of the heavy gilded frame, searching for the release. My fingers found it, a small, carved leaf that depressed with a faint click. With a low groan of protest, the entire painting swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing the flat, gray steel door of a wall safe. My breath hitched. The dial was old, a simple combination lock. My mind raced back to my conversation with Abernathy. Balancing the family books, he'd said. It was a long shot, a wild guess, born of desperation and an understanding of the family's perverse sense of tradition. I thought of the dates I'd uncovered in the archive. The year Thaddeus had his first unacknowledged son, the year his own son did the same, the year Liam was born, the year Daniel was born. I tried them all. Nothing. My hands were slick with sweat. I was running out of time. Then another memory surfaced. A quote from the magazine article, from Mr. Hayes himself, strengthening those foundations, the year the dynasty was founded, the year Thaddeus Hayes first bought the land in Havenwood, 1888. My fingers trembling, I spun the dial. Right to 18, left past it to 88, right to the final 8. I pulled the handle. It didn't move. My heart sank. Then I tried again, my mind clear and cold. Foundation, their first male heir. I went back to the archives in my mind. The birth year of Thaddeus's first stolen son, 1892. Right to 18, left to 92. A solid metallic clunk echoed in the silent room. The safe door swung open. I shone my small flashlight inside. There were some property deeds, some jewelry boxes, and sitting squarely in the middle, one object. It wasn't a diary filled with emotional confessions. It was something far colder, far more damning. A thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind used for accounting. The cover was unmarked. My hand shook as I lifted it out. It was heavy, weighted with the sins of a century. I sat on the floor in the dark library, the beam of my flashlight my only companion, and I opened the book. The pages were filled with a neat, precise, and utterly chilling script. It was a meticulous record. Each entry began with a date. Next to it, a woman's name, Clara Bellwether, Eleanor Vance, and a dozen others I didn't recognize, stretching back through the decades. Beside each name was a figure, listed under a column titled Settlement, Payments for Silence, Payments for a Life. And then, another column, Asset. And next to that, a boy's name, each one a Hayes. It was all there. 100 years of human trafficking, of stolen children and erased women, all documented with the detached precision of a corporate expense report. My eyes scanned the pages, my horror growing with each entry. I turned page after page, the history of their monstrous tradition unfolding before me. I knew what I would find at the end, but I was not prepared for the brutal finality of it. The last page, the last entry. The ink was newer, darker than the rest. The date was from 50 years ago. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the flashlight steady, and there it was, under Asset, Daniel. Next to it, a column I hadn't seen on the other pages, acquisition cost. And beside it, a single, devastating word, discretion. And then, next to that, under the heading of source, was my name, Emma Sullivan. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. Acquisition cost, discretion. They hadn't paid me money. The price they had extracted from me was my silence, my life, my complete and total erasure from my own son's story. I was not a person. I was a transaction. Daniel was not a son. He was an asset. It was the coldest, most brutal summary of my life, written in a stranger's elegant hand in a book of secrets. I closed the ledger, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence of the library. I had it. I had their soul in my hands. And it was time to show it to the world. The air in the Hayes mansion was thick with the scent of lilies and money, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of my throat. For 55 years, that scent had been the fragrance of their power in Havenwood. Tonight, it was the smell of a tomb being prepared. Their 55th wedding anniversary party was a masterpiece of denial, a glittering spectacle of self-congratulation. Crystal glasses chimed, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and the cream of Havenwood society circulated, their laughter as bright and brittle as the diamonds on their wrists. I moved through them like a phantom, a ghost at the feast. I was an accepted anomaly, the strange, quiet woman who had always been on the periphery of their lives, a relic of Liam's childhood. They gave me polite, condescending smiles, their eyes sliding past me, dismissing me as they always had. It was the perfect camouflage. My son Daniel was across the room. He stood tall and confident, a man in his prime, an architect, they'd said with pride. He'd built structures of glass and steel that scraped the sky, a testament to the Hayes legacy of creation. He had a family of his own now, a lovely wife who laughed at something he said, and 2 children who darted through the legs of the adults, blissfully unaware of the foundations of their own lives. I watched him, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I saw the way he gestured with his hands when he spoke, a habit he'd inherited from me. I saw the slight furrow in his brow when he was concentrating, a mirror of my own. These were the tiny, stolen pieces of me that had survived in him, secrets his own body kept. He was my son, yet we were strangers, separated by a chasm of 50 years and a universe of lies. He caught my eye for a moment, a flicker of polite recognition, the look one gives a distant, eccentric aunt. He had no idea he was looking at his mother. The evening wore on, a slow, suffocating parade of speeches. Friends and business partners stood to toast Charles and Eleanor Hayes, praising their generosity, their unwavering commitment to Havenwood, their perfect marriage. Each word was a shovel of dirt on the truth, burying it deeper. Finally, Charles Hayes himself stood, his arm around his wife. He was older, of course, the sharp edges of his authority softened by age, but the arrogance in his eyes was timeless. 55 years, he boomed, his voice resonating with practiced charm. Eleanor and I have built more than a business. We have built a family, a legacy, a tradition of strength, of integrity that will carry the Hayes name for generations to come, to family, to legacy, to tradition. The room erupted in applause, glasses were raised. To tradition, they echoed. This was my moment, the cue I had waited a lifetime for. As the applause died down, I stood up. My hand holding a simple glass of water was perfectly steady. A ripple of surprise went through the room. The string quartet faltered. All eyes turned to me, the forgotten ghost who had suddenly decided to speak. I could see the flicker of annoyance in Charles's eyes, the condescending pity in Eleanor's. Liam, standing beside them, looked uneasy, a premonition of dread clouding his handsome, aging face. "I'd like to tell a story," I began. My voice was not the quavering whisper of an old woman. It was clear, strong, and carried to every corner of the silent room. A story about Havenwood. A story about tradition, legacy, and the price of perfection. I held their gazes, one by one. The air grew still. The polite smiles froze on their faces. They were trapped, held captive by etiquette and curiosity. They thought they were indulging an old woman's ramblings. They had no idea they were about to witness an execution. Our town, I continued, my voice weaving a deliberate hypnotic rhythm, was founded on stories. We tell ourselves that it was built by pioneers with calloused hands and righteous hearts. But there are other stories, quieter ones, that are not carved into the stone of the town square. They are whispered in the foundations of the oldest houses, buried beneath the roots of the oldest trees. This is one of those stories. I didn't look at Liam, but I could feel his stare. I didn't look at Charles or Eleanor, but I could feel their mounting irritation. My focus was on the assembly, on the faces of people who had benefited from the Hayes dynasty their entire lives. And from the corner of my eye, I watched Daniel. He was listening with a polite, detached interest, like a man observing a local curiosity. "It is a story about a very prominent family," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "A family that, for over 100 years, held a sacred, secret tradition. A ritual to ensure their legacy would never falter, that their bloodline would remain pure and strong. You see, they understood that perfection cannot be left to chance. It must be engineered. It must be acquired." A nervous cough broke the silence. Someone shifted in their chair. The story was beginning to feel less like a charming local anecdote, and more like something else entirely. This tradition always began the same way. The eldest son of each generation, before he was to be married to a woman of his own station, was tasked with a special duty. He had to find a girl. Not just any girl. She had to be from the town, from a family of no consequence. She had to be young, trusting and bright with a life that had not yet been lived. She was chosen with the same care a farmer chooses his finest stock. She was befriended. She was courted, in a way. She was made to feel special, chosen, as if she were the center of this golden boy's world. I let my eyes drift towards Liam. His face was losing its color. The confident posture he'd held all night was beginning to slump. He licked his lips, a nervous tic I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "The family," I went on, my voice dropping slightly, drawing them in, "would encourage this friendship. They would welcome the girl into their magnificent home, treat her like a daughter. They would build a beautiful, gilded cage around her, lined with affection and praise, until she no longer saw the bars. She believed she was loved. She believed she had found a second family, a safe harbor. But a harbor is not a home. It is a place to use a vessel before it is sent back out to sea." The room was a tomb now. The only sound was my voice and the frantic beating of my own heart, a drum counting down to the final revelation. Eleanor's manicured hand had gone to her pearl necklace, her knuckles white. And then, when the time was right, when the girl was most vulnerable, the tradition would be consummated. In a library, perhaps, or a forgotten room in a sprawling house, an act would be committed, an act of profound violation, disguised as destiny or inevitability. It was not a crime, you see. In their minds, it was a necessary step. A sacred duty. The price of their continued greatness. Liam went pale, a ghastly, waxy sheen on his skin. He looked like he was going to be sick. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was 50 years too late. He was no longer the golden boy. He was a haunted old man, seeing the ghost of his crime standing before him in the flesh. And 9 months later, a child would be born. A son, almost always. The odds were uncanny. This child, the product of this ritual, was the true prize. The girl would be sent away, her silence bought with threats and shame. The family would then perform their greatest act of benevolence. They would adopt the child. They would give it their name, their wealth, their legacy. They would raise it as their own, often as a younger sibling to the very man who was its father. The perfect heir, born of a body they could control, with no inconvenient maternal ties to challenge their absolute authority. A legacy secured, a tradition upheld, a masterpiece of social engineering. The silence was absolute. It was a physical thing, pressing in on all of us. I saw the dawning, sickening comprehension on the faces of the oldest guests, the ones whose families had been in Havenwood for generations. They were connecting the whispers, the rumors, the strangely timed adoptions that had dotted the Hayes family tree for a century. That's when Charles Hayes finally broke. "Enough!" he roared, slamming his hand on the table. The crystal glasses jumped, one tipping over and spilling red wine like blood across the white tablecloth. "Enough of this vile fantasy! This is a celebration! How dare you come into my home and spew the bitter, senile ramblings of a lonely old woman? You have always been jealous of this family, of what we have. This is nothing but a pathetic attempt to tarnish a name you could never have." He was red-faced, sputtering, his mask of civilized control shattered into 1,000 pieces. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "She's losing her mind. Someone should have her committed. It's dementia, plain and simple. A story spun from bitterness and a fading memory." His words were a storm, meant to blow my own away, to discredit me, to turn the room's shock into pity for him and disgust for me. But I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this. I had counted on it. I let the echoes of his rage fade, and then I spoke into the ringing silence, my voice a blade of calm. "You're right, Charles," I said softly. The entire room leaned in. "It's just a story, but every good story has evidence." Slowly, deliberately, I turned from the head table. I began to walk. Each footstep on the polished hardwood floor was a hammer blow against the silence. The crowd parted for me as if I were a leper or a queen. My destination was the man who stood frozen by the fireplace, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. My son. I stopped in front of Daniel. His eyes were wide, questioning. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew it was centered on him. I reached into the small, elegant purse I carried, a purse I had bought specifically for this moment. I withdrew a small stack of papers, folded neatly. They were pristine, high-resolution copies. The originals were safe, locked away where the Hayes family could never touch them. "I believe this belongs to you," I said, my voice gentle now, imbued with a sorrow that was bottomless. I handed him the pages. He took them automatically, his hands trembling slightly. His wife moved to his side, her face etched with concern. He unfolded the first page. It was a copy of a ledger, the handwriting old-fashioned but perfectly clear. It was a list of names, dates, and figures. The top of the page was titled, "Assets and Acquisitions." He looked up at me, confused. "What is this?" "Keep reading," I whispered. He scanned the list. Names of girls I had never known, girls from the 1920s, the 1890s. Next to their names were dates, and next to the dates, sums of money and terse notes. Agreement reached. Discretion assured. It was a meticulously kept record of human transactions. A logbook of souls. Then he reached the last page, the last entry. The ink was different, more modern, but the cold, clinical precision was the same. He saw the name first. Daniel Hayes. His own name. Then he saw the date of his birth. And then, next to it, under the column heading Source Asset, he read my name, Emma Larson. Beneath that, a final chilling entry in the column labeled Notes. A single devastating phrase that summed up my entire life. Cost of acquisition. Discretion. The world stopped. I watched the color drain from my son's face. I saw his eyes scan the words again, and then again, his mind refusing to process the monstrous equation laid out before him. His own name. My name. The people he called his parents. The man he called his brother. His entire life, every memory, every achievement, every birthday, every Christmas morning. It was all a lie, a transaction, an acquisition. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He just made a small, choked sound, the sound of a man's soul breaking. He looked up from the paper, his eyes finding mine for a brief, shattering moment. In them, I saw 50 years of questions he never knew he had. Then his gaze shifted, moving past me, past the horrified guests, to the head of the room. He looked at Charles and Eleanor Hayes, the magnificent architects of his life, and in his eyes was a look of such profound betrayal, such hollowed-out devastation, that it was more damning than any accusation could ever be. His entire world, so carefully constructed for him, had crumbled to dust in his hands. The aftermath was not a storm, but a vacuum. The great hall of the Hayes mansion, moments before filled with laughter and music, fell into a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. The implosion was not loud, it was total. Guests didn't run. They simply dissolved, slipping out of the room one by one, their faces averted, as if looking at the Hayes family was to look upon something profane. They took with them the story, not as a piece of gossip, but as a contagion. The party evaporated, leaving behind only the hosts, standing amidst the wreckage of their legacy. Charles, Eleanor, and Liam were frozen, statues in a tableau of their own making. And then there was Daniel. He stood by the fireplace, the ledger pages still clutched in his hand, the paper crinkling with the force of his grip. He was the bomb that had been ticking in the heart of their family for 50 years, and I had just lit the fuse. He finally moved, walking slowly, deliberately towards them. He didn't look at Liam. Liam was a ghost to him now, a brother who was a father, a friend who was a violator. His focus was entirely on Charles and Eleanor, the people he had called mother and father. Is it true? His voice was unnervingly calm, stripped of all emotion. It was the voice of a man who had been hollowed out. Eleanor was the first to find her voice, a desperate, syrupy stream of words. "Daniel, darling, you don't understand. We did it for you. We wanted you. We love you so much. You are our son, our beloved son. This woman is a poison, twisting things." "Is it true?" he repeated, his voice cutting through her lies like glass. He held up the paper. "Is this my story? Was my life a business transaction?" Charles, his face a purple mask of fury, tried to reclaim his power. "You will not speak to your mother that way. This is nonsense, a fabrication by a bitter, lonely—" "Don't," Daniel said. The word was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. Charles flinched, his mouth falling open. For the first time in his life, his son had told him what to do, and the authority in that single word was absolute. The power in the room had shifted, irrevocably. "All my life," Daniel said, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "I felt something was off. A piece missing. I thought it was me. I thought I was ungrateful, that I didn't appreciate the perfect life you gave me. But it wasn't a life. It was a possession. You didn't raise a son. You curated an asset." He looked at Liam then, a long, empty look. "And you," he said, his voice flat. "My brother, my big brother, who taught me how to throw a baseball. Who was my hero? Were you playing a part too, all these years? Was it just part of the deal, the price of your own inheritance?" Liam couldn't speak. He just shook his head, tears streaming down his face, a pathetic, broken old man who had traded his soul for a life of comfort. Daniel turned back to Charles and Eleanor. "You didn't just lie to me. You erased her." He gestured towards me, not with anger, but with a kind of dawning, horrified awe. "You erased my mother. You let her live in this town, a ghost, while I lived in her abuser's house, calling them family. Did you ever think about her, or was she just the cost of doing business?" There was no answer. There was no defense for the indefensible. In that moment, the Hayes dynasty died. Not in a courtroom, not under the glare of news cameras, but right there, in their own monument to their greatness, under the cold, unforgiving gaze of the son they had stolen. The story, my story, bled out into Havenwood. It wasn't a sudden flood, but a slow, unstoppable tide of whispers. It was told over phone lines, in hushed tones at the grocery store, in canceled contracts and rescinded invitations. The name Hayes, once a symbol of power and prestige, became a synonym for a monstrous hypocrisy. Their empire, built over a century of calculated cruelty, evaporated not in a year or a month, but in a single night. Their power was never in their money, it was in their name, and I had taken that from them. My revenge was never about watching them in a prison cell. A cage of their own making was far more fitting. It was never about financial compensation. No amount of money could buy back a stolen life. It was about dismantling the machine. It was for me, sitting in the silence of my own home, finally able to breathe. And it was for them, the nameless, faceless girls in that ledger, the girls from 1942 and 1911 and 1888. I had given them a voice. I had become their reckoning. A week after the party, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hesitant. It was from Daniel. He has reached out. We have spoken on the phone. The calls are awkward, stilted, filled with the vast, silent spaces of 50 years of unsaid words. We are strangers, connected by a tragedy so profound it has its own gravity. He is grappling with a life built on a lie. I am learning the shape of a son I have only ever known as a ghost. It will take time to build something new from the rubble. I don't know if we ever can. Some chasms are too wide to cross. But as I sit on my porch today, the same porch where I sat as a lonely girl dreaming of a life that was never mine, I am not that girl anymore. I am not the broken thing from the library. I am not the silent woman in exile, the town eccentric. The cage is gone. The silence is broken. I am the architect of a dynasty's downfall. I didn't get justice in a courtroom. I seized it with my own 2 hands. And for the first time in 55 years, I am free. The Hayes family built their legacy on silencing women, on the belief that some stories are too inconvenient to be told. But every story deserves a voice, and every secret, no matter how deeply buried, yearns for the light. What do you think? If you discovered a secret that could destroy a powerful family but also shatter the lives of people you care about, what would you do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.